Hi everyone, welcome to another installment of Manic episodes. Today we're doing another series overview for a show called Werewolf. This came out a few years before She-Wolf of London did, and the shows are both about werewolves, but the take on the mythology is a little different. The story focuses on Eric Cord, who's bitten by his best friend after he turns into a werewolf. Hello again, Raphael Sabarge. He has to kill his friend, and ends up both a werewolf himself and wanted for murder. After discovering that he can cure himself if he kills the first werewolf, the first in the bloodline, he travels from town to town trying to find him, all while encountering various scumbags, getting into sticky situations, and being chased down by a bounty hunter. It's basically the Incredible Hulk, but with a werewolf. Ironically, the main character is probably the weakest point. While they do put Eric in some interesting situations and write him sympathetically, I just don't think John J. York was a strong enough actor to pull it off. The character comes off pretty bland and stiff most of the time, so the quality of the episode usually depends on how good the story is that week. I never truly felt the emotional depth of Eric's situation, and the story suffers because there are no recurring non-villain characters for him to interact with. He has a girlfriend he leaves in the first episode, but then she's never mentioned again. He has no living relatives, and, well, he killed his best friend, and that should have some sort of weight to it, but it really doesn't. And part of it is because you never got to know these people he cared about. Other than his girlfriend, it didn't seem like Eric had much of a life anyway. And, well, he forgets about her pretty quickly whenever a love interest of the week comes around. It feels like the character went somewhat unexplored, because while they looked at other characters dealing with inner turmoil as werewolves, Eric was more like a superhero with anger management issues. Only not green. The only character he killed that wasn't technically a bad guy was his best friend, and that was before he even became a werewolf and in self-defense. Think about it. What if he did kill innocent people? You'd be left with a hero who's also a murderer, and maybe have him search for redemption or have a spiritual crisis. Instead, Eric's just sort of bummed about his situation. However, where the human side of Eric is lacking, the werewolf side is very well done. As much as I like the design of She-Wolf of London's werewolf, one might construe it as a bit silly at times. But the werewolf in this show is pretty badass. And especially considering the budget and time constraints of a TV show, that's a pretty big feat. Check out the opening kill from the pilot. It doesn't even seem like a television episode.
Look, it was just probably some jerk who saw me go back for my keys.
Let's just get out of here.
What the hell?
No, don't open the door!
What the hell is up there?
Oh!
Although, I found it a bit hard to understand how the werewolf worked in the series, because at first you think it's the full moon, but then it's like every night. But sometimes not. It kinda seems like the transformations are random. It's always at night, but it isn't consistent in when it happens. Here's how the transformations usually play out. Eric sees the mark on his hand bleeding, he turns into a werewolf in a convenient place where only the bad guys die, and the next day a guitar riff plays because, it's sad. Boy, do they love that guitar riff. Although the show focused on Eric, there were a couple more recurring characters, one of which was Alamo Joe Rogan, the bounty hunter who's trying to take him in. And although he is a villain in a technical sense, I did like that he was in the gray area most of the time. Eric first comes across Joe in the pilot, and Joe discovers that he's a werewolf pretty quickly. With this knowledge, he knows that Eric is a danger to himself and others, and must either kill him or bring him to justice. And in a way, he was right. Pretty much every week, Eric kills someone, and it's just lucky for him that it's always a stupid burglar or rapist or whatever. It's not like the werewolf knows the difference. And I don't know if it was in Joe's actor's contract to be in every episode or what, but most of his appearances amount to Joe shows up at the beginning, chases Eric into the next town, and disappears until next time. So sometimes it felt like the character was just crammed in because they had to, or just as a story device. However, when they actually utilized this character, it worked really well. This wasn't a cut-and-dry villain, this was someone who was technically in the right.
Why you keep on running, it doesn't make sense to me.
I know it doesn't to you. Sometimes it hasn't even made sense to me.
What's it like when it comes over you? Would you know your own mother? Were your parents still alive? Could you spare them?
I'd like to think so.
There was a great two-part episode where Joe goes after Eric, and Eric ends up shot and seemingly killed, while Joe almost gets his throat ripped out. His life is saved, but no one knows whether he was bit or scratched, leaving him to wonder if he's become the thing he's hunting, and if he should take his own life. I liked that the episodes explored these issues and put him in the same situation as Eric, and ultimately asked what direction he would take, which is entirely different than Eric's approach. The episodes also flash back to his life before all of this, when he had a wife, and what led him here. I think the second half was probably the only episode to focus on a character that wasn't Eric, so it was interesting to see that. The third recurring character was Janos Skorzeny, played by Chuck Connors, and he was a great villain. Whereas Joe was somewhat sympathetic, Skorzeny was an evil bastard that'd kill you pretty quickly. That is, except for Eric, I think because he found him amusing. Now, for most of the series, Skorzeny is set up as the first werewolf, and that changes near the end, but I'll get to that in a minute. Skorzeny is an evil, immortal werewolf/sailor type with one eye, and he's pretty sweet. He was actually in less than half of the episodes, but whenever he was around, he stole the show. Chuck Connors did a great job with the character, and he commanded every scene he was in. One of the best moments of the series was when he and Eric fight in the pilot as werewolves, and you get to first see his transformation. What I liked about him was that he really wasn't human anymore, even when he wasn't a wolf, and he was scary and seemed like he actually posed a threat. And that's when the show decided to fudge it up. I don't know if Chuck Connors wanted to move on to other projects, or if they just felt this was a good way to progress the story, but near the end of the first and only season, they decided to kill Skorzeny off. And with a stand-in because he didn't even bother to show up. Even better. It turned out that Skorzeny was not the first werewolf, but instead it was the go-to replacement villain, Brian Thompson. It seemed like a weird choice, not only because of the strange timing, but because Skorzeny never seemed to have a motive to lie about his status. Why was he acting like he was the first werewolf, telling Eric that he was one of his, etc., etc.? And don't get me wrong, Brian Thompson plays a good villain, but he doesn't compare to Chuck Connors with his performance. He seemed a bit too frilly, too put together. It didn't read werewolf to me. It kind of had a vampire vibe to it, especially with the period flashbacks to his character. It was interesting that the show was taking a different direction and actually telling a real story arc, and believe me, after 20-something episodes of the week, it needed it badly. But it just started too late into the series, and it seemed especially wasted since the show wasn't renewed. Since I brought it up, though, let's talk about the episodes. Unlike She-Wolf of London, this series does not have a variety of monsters in it, just werewolves. There is one weird, kinda sorta exception, but I'll talk about it in a second. So, this meant that Eric would often find himself in a lot of real-world situations, like family abuse, robberies, prostitutes in danger, and so on. And somehow they had to find a way to solve all of these things with a werewolf. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. However, even with the variety of situations presented here, it got really repetitious. Almost every episode involved Eric getting framed for something, which is just frustratingly tedious since he's already on the run for murder anyway. And I mean it, he gets framed a lot. He just has that frame me kind of face, I guess. But look, you can find other ways to progress your stories. Just saying. The episodes focusing on werewolves, or Eric's werewolf side, were usually pretty decent though, such as one where Eric comes across a priest who's a werewolf and the moral dilemma there, or when Eric is lost in the wilderness and befriends a dog. I mean, wolf. Whatever, I'll buy it. You also got to see a lot of familiar actors on this show, such as this guy, this chick, and this lady, among others. Speaking of that lady, though, can I just mention how out of place her episode was? Okay, so far in this series, Eric is on the run and helping others out in real situations while searching for Scorzini, after having promised his girlfriend in the first episode he'd come back and then promptly forgetting about her. In this episode, he meets a witch. Or a Wiccan. Whatever, something very out of place for a show that does not feature anything else of paranormal origin. And the townsfolk don't trust her because she's a witch, and Eric falls in love with her. Maybe. And then she's burned to death. And that's the end of the episode. And it's not like Eric learns anything here, or the story has progressed at all. He kills the bad guys in the end and goes, yeah, bummer, I kinda like that chick. They try to play it off as meaningful, I guess, but we didn't really give a crap about this character in the first place. And it's never mentioned again. And that's the problem I had with this series, the it's never mentioned again thing. They have his chase for Scorzini and Joe hunting him down as continuous things, but other than that, the slate is wiped clean every week. So no matter how attached you get to the characters or story for that episode, you can't, because you never see these characters again, and it doesn't even affect the main character past that point. And I'm not saying everything has to be intricately connected, I just didn't see any real progress with Eric's character. He's bummed about being a werewolf, and once he's not anymore, he plans to go back to his life, and whoop-de-doo. Maybe they were planning on changing this once Brian Thompson's Grey Wolf character came into play, but I can only speculate on that since that's not what we were shown for most of the series. However, there were some strong episodes and some silly ones, and like I said, it was a mixed bag. The show also really feels like a product of its time, and has a nostalgic vibe to it, whether you watch the show in the 80s or not. The main character is lacking a little for me, but the performances of both recurring villains are compelling to watch and worth the time sitting through the silliness for it. It's definitely not a bad take on werewolves, and it presents a good spectrum of wolfy situations. And at only one season, with each episode being half an hour, it's a pretty easy watch. Unfortunately, due to music rights issues, the show has no official release, but you can watch reruns on the Chiller Network and find copies online if you're curious about it. So check it out, especially if you're a werewolf aficionado. It'll definitely satisfy your lycanthropic cravings.
There are two kinds of people in this world. Those who believe in flying saucers and those who don't. When the world isn't the same as our minds believe, then we are in a nightmare. And nothing is worse than a nightmare. Except one you can't wake up from.
Sarcasm in my smile. You better